In this video, we're going to be looking at customizing and containerizing Autogen Studio. Several powerful reasons why you may want to do that. On one hand, if you've installed things with Python before, sometimes there get to be dependency problems and you may run into challenges with installation. Now, Autogen Studio has been very good about keeping their Python installation pretty smooth, but nonetheless, when you have a container that's built, it's done. It has everything that it needs in it, and you can continue to run that as needed, and it'll continue to work for you. You also have these great scanning tools to scan your containers for security vulnerabilities. But what I appreciate about it most is for packaging and distributing my implementation of Autogen Studio. I can go and I can create my custom workflows, custom skills, custom agents, and models, and so on, and then save my container to a container registry to where anybody who can run a container is able to pull my image down and then load up, and then they'll have the same exact copy of all the customizations I made in a model that I'm confident will work for them. This is useful if you're supporting a team of developers perhaps, and you have a standard set of models and skills and agents that you want to make available to your team of developers. That is a use case that I want to do, and I also want to distribute some of these instances to non-developers who can make powerful use of these really cool multi-agent workflows. And the Autogen Studio GUI, it gives me a nice, easy-to-use method that I could maybe create custom and complex agent workflows for peers that maybe they're not coders, but they can put these tools to good use. So I can package it in a container and make it accessible. I could take that container and I could set it up on a Kubernetes environment and give it an ingress, so that way people can not have to run the container, but just potentially access it by going to a URL that you've published and made available to them. So lots of cool things you can do once you've containerized it. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. I have my local copy of Visual Studio Code. I'm running this on my MacBook here, and I just put a little notes of the high-level steps we'll be taking to build this into a container today. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to fork the Autogen repo. That essentially gives me if you're not familiar with GitHub, it gives me an exact kind of copy of the official Microsoft Autogen code repository, and I can make changes to my local copy while still leaving it connected to Microsoft's version. So that way, as they make updates, I want to keep my copy up to date. And it provides a method that I can continue to pull updates from Microsoft as they make those updates, and keep my local copy up to date. Yet I still have some flexibility to make some customizations to my own version as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and fork that Autogen repo. I have another video that covered customization. We'll look at that again in this. You don't have to watch the other video about customization. In this case, there is this file called dbdefaults.json that's in the Autogen Studio repository. And if you can define custom models, agents, workflows, and skills in that file, so that way you can completely customize your implementation of Autogen Studio by setting up that file. And then when you build this instance of Autogen Studio, it will load up with all those customizations already present. And so we're going to customize that file. We're going to look at the Docker file. I already have a Docker file prepared for this. Now you'll see some Docker files on the Autogen repo. I don't think that any of the Docker files there are complete and functional for Autogen Studio today, last I looked. But they're working on some, so rather than using your own version or my version, if there isn't already, there will be an official version that should work for a similar purpose here. And I'll keep an eye on that and maybe make another video about it once it's available. But in the meantime, I have a Docker file I've created for this purpose. So we're going to review that, and then we'll build it. And once we build that container, we'll go ahead and run it and see how that works. If you worked with containers before, it's once you have the container built, it's a very straightforward process to upload your container to a container registry such as Docker Hub, or if you're doing it within your own company, you have private container registries that you can upload to. We won't cover the uploading part in this video. We'll just get to building and ensuring that the container works and go from there. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So I'm going to go to the Autogen repository here. I'm going to go right to the root of the repository. And if I go here, I can see the option to fork this repository. So I'll go ahead and click that fork button. This is one of my GitHub personalities here, this AFEWELL, and I'll call this one Autogen, and keep everything else the same. And I'm just going to copy the main branch only. I don't need the other branches. We'll go ahead and create fork, and in just a few seconds here, GitHub will set up essentially a clone of that Microsoft Autogen repository here. And you can see here that it knows my repository has this information. It is forked from Microsoft Autogen, so it keeps this as the upstream repository. But if you look at my URL now, this is no longer Microsoft's instance of it. This is my instance. And so first thing I want to do here is I want to be able to customize my local copy of the DB defaults file. And I want to make sure that when I pull updates from Microsoft Autogen, that it's not just going to automatically overwrite any changes that I make to this. And if I was going to make a lot of changes to a lot of different files, I may use a different strategy. But in this case, since I'm just only updating that one file, that will make it easy for me to preserve the easy ability to pull in updates from their repository and have it be able to update pretty much everything short of this one file. And when I do that, I should always go and check the current version of this particular file manually to see what changes that there may be in it, to make sure that if I want to or need to update my copy based on some changes that they've made, I can do that manually. So I'm going to go ahead and click in to see my DB defaults file. I'm going to go ahead and just copy the path to the DB defaults so I can put the path in here. And from the root, we're going to go into samples, apps, Autogen Studio, utils, and dbdefaults.json. And then I can just copy this path here. And then we can go back to the root. I'm going to go into that gitignore file. And I'm just going to go to the bottom here. And then we'll go, and I'll just create dbdefaults.json. And once we do that, we can commit changes. It's best practice to use good messages here and so on. This is just a temporary thing for a video, so I'm going to skip past. And so now we can see that our gitignore file has been updated. And again, what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that this file is not tracked. So that way, when I pull updates, it won't just automatically overwrite the changes I've made locally. And now we'll go into our DB defaults file. So again, that was in samples, Autogen Studio, utils, DB default, and I'm just going to edit this in the browser. And I'll have another video where we go into more detailed customizations of this file, but for now I just want to make some simple customizations to validate that our customizations worked. So we'll call our primary assistant here, we'll call this a little different than I did in the last one. I'm just going to call it Docker primary assistant. Just for fun, since we're doing a Docker build with this one. And so we have a Docker primary assistant, and I'll also change our general agent workflow here. And I'm going to call this one, I'll just say containerized workflow, and we'll go ahead and commit those changes. Again, I can skip past some of these things. For this one, is a temporary environment only for this demo. So now I've gone ahead and I've customized my dbdefaults.json file. I can come back to my VS Code. Let's go ahead and review this Docker file. The Docker file does not need to be in the repository, and you'll see why here in a second. So I'm using Ubuntu. Now, the default Ubuntu container is actually pretty slim. It's not Alpine or anything, but if I were really going to be focusing on performance engineering this, I'd probably go a different path. But I'm really thinking of this as something that is more for developing right now. And even as I distribute it, I'm distributing it is not really be concerned with performance engineering. This is going to be changing a lot. I'm a lot more concerned right now with the pace of change, making it easy for me to keep this up to date. As things stabilize, or if we start to push these into some type of production context, I probably will use a build pack or have a more highly optimized Docker file or multi-stage builds and slimming down the container more and so on. But for my purposes, Ubuntu meets my needs. Then we go ahead and, again, avoid the prompts from apps by making the front end non-interactive. And we install our dependencies, get curl, Python 3, pip, and virtual env. And then we go ahead and pull the current version of Node.js. So, this is pulling a current version, and I'm not specifying versions specifically for any of these. So, the good of that is, like, once the container is built, it's already built, and this will only run during the build process. And when we do run this, it's going to pull whichever versions that, in this first case, the default app environment sees as the current version. And then for Node, it's going to pull whatever Node source she thinks is current at the time of build. And so it's a chance when you rebuild, if there is any error at the time of a fresh build, those errors can be manifest in the containers. And so every time you build a container, you always want to make sure you have either automated or manual testing pipeline to test and validate that. It's the same as you would locally. If you're building or installing a new implementation on a given day, it may have updates and it may have new bugs or have problems. So inside of the container, it will clone the Git repository. That's why I don't have to put the Docker file inside of the Git repository, right? I'm going to run it, or sorry, the container itself, wherever I run it from, will clone the Git repository, so it doesn't need to be ran from there. I will save a template version of the Docker file, but you'll see I'm going to do some stuff with my API keys, so I'm not going to save the secret version of my Docker file on my repository. And then this will go ahead and navigate to the correct, once it clones Autogen, it will navigate to the correct environment to go ahead and build the Python portion. And then it's going to install our Gatsby and our Yarn, and then navigate to the front end directory to install Yarn within the project and then build the project. It's going to expose port 8081, and then for the entry point, we're going to activate our venv and export our OpenAI API key. Now, why did I put this down here instead of just creating an environmental variable in my Docker file like this? Right? Well, because whatever I put here, this is built into my containers. Whereas here at my entry point, by putting it here, the value will be saved in my Docker file. But my Docker file is not part of the inside of the container. But still something you want to be sensitive with, right? When you load this, right, it's going to have the API key in the environment. So if there's any way for an end user to get access to the terminal, they could potentially look at this environmental variable and see your OpenAI key. And so you have to think about how you want to distribute this. You might put this in a CI/CD pipeline, so that way you could have other people have their own custom builds of the Docker file. You might have them inject it after the fact when they do their Docker run commands. I thought about that for a minute, and I thought this would be an easier way to keep the key off the screen for recording, but this doesn't make sense to put the API key right here for me anyways, for most use cases, I don't think. So I went ahead and I just deleted the API key here from my entry point, and we'll go and I added it to the instructions for the steps. I'll put on my GitHub repository. And so you can see here with the -e flag, you can put an environmental variable and inject it into the Docker container. And this will inject it before any of your command or entry point instructions are executed. And so it will work, should work just fine to do it this way, and it'll be a lot easier to manage keeping the key secret. If you want to run it in Kubernetes or something after the fact, and you can just make that part of your manifests and have it injected that way. So very simple and usable Docker file. Now go ahead and I just did the Docker build. I took this Docker file. I went ahead and paused it during the Docker build because it took at least 10 minutes probably to build this Docker file. But just to reiterate, this is the exact Docker file we've been reviewing. This is what I ran, and you can see here Docker build -t Autogen Studio, just like in the instructions, and it ran through and created a so now if I go Docker images, probably have a lot of images in here. So I already have one in here called Autogen Studio. I didn't realize I already had a container in here called Autogen Studio. I should just rename this. And so to do that, we'll call this Docker tag, and we're going to say Autogen-Studio latest. And I'll just rename it Autogen Studio Custom. Now if I go into my Docker images, I should see that. So here's the Docker tag, and we can see right at the very top, Autogen Studio Custom. And so now to run this command. Okay, I made one small mistake there, and I found out what it was. I need to specify the host as 0.0.0.0 within the container, otherwise it's not going to be accessible correctly. There's a couple different ways of doing it. I went ahead and added it to the entry point command here, and so once I did that, rebuilt the container, and then started the container. Again, I'm not going to show the start command because it has my OpenAI key in it, but the same one we saw here. And we can see our Autogen Studio is running. And we'll jump in here to look at the build tab to see if our customizations took effect. And we can see right away there's that containerized workflow, so I changed the name on that. I also changed the name on this agent here called Docker Primary Assistant. And so we can see we're now serving Autogen Studio from a container that's built with all of our customized assets. And in a next video, we'll continue to build on this. There's a couple additional things I want to do. I'll make a video where I do a lot more customizations to this file. I want to have it pre-connected to the models that are available inside of my company. Now, it's useful for me, but hopefully it's also useful for others who, in many cases, may have models that are hosted inside of their company. And even if not, being able to see how to customize this. So I'm going to package up this container ready to go for if I can share it with my peers on my team, they'll be able to hit the ground running and just load this up. But again, we've been doing it this way where I'm running it on Kubernetes, but in this kind of developer way where I'm using my Kubernetes cluster just like I might use like GitHub Codespace or something, not the way that I would normally extend this to a user. And so another video, we'll go ahead and put this in Kubernetes in the way I would normally serve it to an end user. In this case, I'll put it on my own intranet, but I'll share how I'm doing that. And that way, my other folks within my company who'd like to use this can have access to it, but through the web interface. On one hand, I may have other developers that I'll want to share the same way I'm using it now, but I also have classes of users who are business users who will probably do a lot of really cool stuff with a no-code interface, but don't need to and don't really want to mess around with how to bootstrap this. So I'll have that video to deploy this on Kubernetes with a Ingress resource. And I'll model that on my intranet. It would be essentially the same process if you wanted to use Kubernetes to make a publicly available endpoint and host an Autogen application that way. So that's it for this video. Thanks a lot for joining. I hope to see you in the follow-on videos. Thanks a lot.